Hello everyone, I'm Mohammad Heidarikhah, your host, an HR director and business developer, and I believe that change is an art. Your leadership is a craft. Welcome back to TalentTalks, the podcast where we explore the human side of leadership, talent, and transformative growth. In this episode, I'm honored to be joined by Lou Zawada, an accomplished executive coach, mentor, facilitator, and change consultant. Lou specializes in guiding executives and senior leaders through complex change with clarity, confidence, and stronger leadership, helping them cut through the noise and make better decisions. With over 20 years of experience, Lou has worked with hundreds of leaders across high-stakes industries, including mining, property, family offices, government, professional services, aged care, and energy, sectors where the pressure is intense and the pace never slows. Tune in to gain actionable insights on how to navigate change effectively, lead with intention, and strengthen your impact even when the stakes are high. Thank you for listening and keep leading with craft. Warmly, Mohammad. Hello, my dear Lou Zawada. Welcome to Talent Talks, and thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
No, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. It was lovely to meet a few weeks ago and to be on the podcast today. So thanks, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you so much. Would you please tell the audience about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Lou. I'm based in Perth in Western Australia, and my background originally was in the HR organisational development space, but for the past sort of 15 plus years, organisational change transformation. So have a deep passion for transformation and all things change. And then more recently, in the past 4 years, I've been running my own consultancy as an executive coach and consultant. So I still do a fair amount of work in the transformation space, but more so working with leaders and senior leaders, teams in terms of helping them effective through coaching and other means. A little bit of strategy work for transformation for organisations, less so delivery these days, but always like to keep my hand in that world because it's what I'm passionate about, and very strongly believe that when organisations do get change and transformation right, it makes a massive difference, not just to their productivity and their performance as an organisation, but their engagement and their culture of the people working within the organisational system.
Wow, so hard, not too difficult, but you can handle that. The first question is, what does messy change mean to you based on your experience?
Yeah, messy, it's an interesting word, isn't it? Because it's kind of, I think the association with messy a lot of the time is a negative, when really it probably just means unstructured or unfamiliar and kind of not ordered. And I think a lot of that is real change at its heart. Is change is not necessarily always straightforward and linear. It's a very human process to go through, and so we're talking mostly in an organisational context here, but we all experience change in every facet of our life, and it's not always expected or what we perceive to be within our control. It's human, it's unpredictable, but that's real. So when I think of the word messy, I think about it as actually feeling like, well, that's just real change at work.
Wow. Can you share a personal leadership lesson you learned the hard way during a major transition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably early on in the piece, when you don't have as much of experience and you perhaps don't have the same level of bravery that comes with the experience, is potentially misunderstanding or assuming that silence equaled alignment or agreement. So I once had a project where the signals were that no one was really saying anything, and I took that as, everyone's on board and everyone's supportive of this. And then it wasn't until things didn't really move forward and we felt like we weren't having much success or progress, that I took a step back and recalibrated and re-engaged and realised just because people are not saying something, or even if they're kind of silently nodding, isn't always an indicator, and you need to do some of that deeper work. So that was a pretty key lesson early on. So I'm very careful to not assume, to always validate along the way. And it doesn't need to be difficult or onerous or even time consuming to do that. But it's something I tell new change practitioners is, one, don't bring your own assumptions in. Don't assume that you know what people are saying just, through past experience. And don't assume that because they're not saying anything that equals alignment.
Were they satisfied?
Yeah. Mixed in that example. So yeah, for some, I guess the assumption was correct. For others, not the case, and that was obviously indicated by the fact that we weren't moving forward. So yeah, it's an interesting one. When you say satisfied, I also get people talk to me a lot about how do I make people happy about a change, and our job is not to make people unhappy, but happiness is not necessarily always a measure of success either. It depends obviously on the transformation or the change that you're working in, but people don't necessarily need to be happy about something, but they can accept something might be changing because that's the right thing for the organisation, even if it might not be their personal preference. And there's quite a big distinction there. So
Yeah, I understand what you say. Uh, what is one myth, about change management that you wish would disappear?
That it's all about the plan. That if you have a good plan, and like a fancy Gantt chart and a strategy, that'll be enough. And that's just not the case. So change happens at the speed of trust, and trust is a human relationship and emotion to be built. And you can have an amazing plan, but if you haven't done the other work, the human work, then really it's not going to be very helpful for you in the long
Most
run.
of us
So
are good planners, but we do
yeah,
not, have that kind of commitment to those plans. Next question
yeah,
would
and
be,
it's
okay, go on.
sorry, I was just
No,
going to
go on, go
say,
on.
yeah, I was just going to say, I think also, when people think about plan, they think about something to manage, but change is something to lead. So, like at its heart, this concept of change management, it's leadership. It's leadership with a focus around change. But, I think, that gets misconstrued sometimes.
I see, I see. How's your own definition of a strong leadership evolved through tough transformation?
Mm, Probably early on, I thought it was just about being really, really decisive, and decisiveness is definitely a quality that leaders need to have. But I think I've evolved it to think more around, for me, it's steadiness. So I think you can be really decisive in a moment, but unsteady across, a period of time. And that's not necessarily helpful when you're leading through change. So I would say that's probably a key shift, is around how do you create this sense of steadiness, predictability in an unpredictable set of circumstances, and this confidence that there's sort of this calmness that runs through the change process, because that's what really helps people to feel anchored and builds that trust, is when they feel like what I see today from my leader is similar to what I'm going to see in 100 days' time, even if everything else is changing around it. Not that you're going to have this person who's uber excited and confident, and then, 2 weeks later, they're really sort of feeling fear and they've dipped down into negativity and almost, like a little bit of frustration, and then they've got this wave that goes up and down. So I'd say, probably really powerful change is steady change.
Yeah, I understand. Uh, Walk us through your first 90-day plan when stepping into a complex change initiative. What are your non-negotiable actions?
Mm, yeah. And 90 days seems both far and short at the same time, doesn't it? And oftentimes in change, I think it's getting better, but, in the old days, a lot of the times change practitioners would be brought in quite late in the piece. I think organisations are definitely getting better at that and engaging up front, and when they're even thinking about, like, from a strategic perspective, what it is that they're potentially wanting to do, which is really helpful, because we do have to move at pace, and we don't always have the luxury of time. But for me, whether it's 90 days or 9 days, the first thing that I do is to go in and observe and listen and ask really meaningful questions. So probably that's where I put my coaching hat on as well, is not necessarily because I need an outcome or piece of information from someone, but I want to understand what's the dynamic, what are the relationships, what are the pain points, what are people seeing, feeling, and hearing about the circumstances that they've got at that particular time. And I do all of that before I even start to, build anything. So a bit of kind of mental mapping, I guess, in terms of relationships and sort of people and where they're positioned. But a lot of it is actually hard to show tangibly because it is having lots of conversations and doing lots of deep listening.
Do you have to push them? Sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah, it depends on the person, depends on their past experience, and whether they've had good experiences or not so great experiences with other change processes. It depends on their capacity and their sometimes their capability as well in terms of how they show up. But I mean, I do pride myself that I feel like I obviously work in the people space. I'm passionate about people. I'm interested in people. One of my strongest qualities is building relationships and building them quickly. So majority of the time, but yeah, every now and then you'll get someone who's a bit cagey, and but I think that is also on me then to be really clear and have powerful questions that shows that there's not hidden intent, that I'm transparent right from the get-go, and that usually helps people to open up.
Lucky them, because they are working with you. Next question would be, how do you balance the need for a clear plan with the inevitable need to adapt when things get messy? Sorry.
Mm. It's a balance, isn't it? So I think you need structure, a degree of structure, but not being rigid. So for me, it's like understanding what does clear actually mean. And so oftentimes I'll go in and I'll talk about, okay, it's about showing intent. So what are the goals? What are the principles that we're working to? How might those evolve? What are we measuring? What are the touch points? Those types of things. So there's still a level of transparency and tangibility in terms of talking about them, but without kind of locking people into, okay, well, it's going to, first of all, we're going to do this. I know in my mind roughly how things are going to, sort of be led and managed, and from years of doing this, and in terms of working within kind of frameworks, but they don't need to know that. So what's more important is well, how is this going to impact me? How is this going to impact my team? What are we talking about here? And talking about goals and principles, and what we are going to identify in terms of measures really helps, without feeling like it's 100% locked in, and therefore then you've got that flexibility and that agility to move without feeling that you're rigid, because rigidity doesn't help. Both a rigid mindset and a rigid work practice is not helpful in change, because
I suppose you have to
doesn't work like
sacrifice
that
sometimes, don't you?
What do you mean? What, sacrifice the level of rigidity, or
Yeah.
sacrifice your intent? Yeah, I mean, it's rare that even with things like business cases and strategies, organisations will have a degree of information and they'll have an idea of what they want to achieve. But until you go in and you do the work and you start talking to people and you use the phrase, look under the hood of the car, then other things come out, and it would be irresponsible to ignore those. So you only will know them when you get into it and you start to have that level of engagement. So yeah, you have to be open to that for sure.
Wow. Great for you. Next question would be, one major reason change fails is poor communication. As everyone knows, what does effective, resilient communication look like in the messy middle?
Mm. Probably two things. People misconstrue sometimes that communication is just sending out messages, and really effective communication is that you have processes and practices where you're both sending and receiving information. I mean, that's what it's about, is creating a dialogue. So you've got to have really effective ways of doing that. And that is hard when you're talking about organisations that are thousands of people and hundreds of processes and these really large, complex organisational transformations. However, everybody knows about surveys, everybody knows about focus groups, everybody knows about kind of town halls. There's so many very tried and true and traditional practices of how we share information within an organisations that can be modelled to enable two-way. So that's probably one. And the other one is, this is something I work on with leaders that I coach quite a lot. They have this fear of being annoying or overbearing or, looking incompetent because they're having to say the same messages multiple times. But the reality is we are bombarded with info, across all aspects of our life. And there's this saying, you need to say something 7 times for it to really hit home. There is truth in that. And it might not be 7 times every time for every person, but there is repetition builds consistency, which builds clarity, which builds confidence, because people are hearing the same message or a similar message, and it's building that cognition of, oh, okay, this is something important, and I can see that, what they said 2 months ago and they're saying again today and they're going to say again in another 3 months. The same thread is there, and so therefore this is likely to happen and it's meaningful and I should pay attention to that. And I think leaders trip themselves up, when you say we've got to be repetitive with some of this stuff. They think it's saying the exact same thing in the exact same way to the exact same group of people, and that's not the case. It's having the intent of a message threaded through, and it could be you run into someone in the coffee line, when you're getting your morning coffee and you're sort of chatting just about general work stuff and, signalling something in that. It could be a town hall, it could be an email, it could be through your normal one-to-ones. We've got no end of touch points with people in our organisation. And it's not being robotic and trotting out the same exact message, but it's having the intent or the core of a message being really consistent. And it's really important when it is messy, because it's very easy for people to get distracted. So we have to help them. That's our job as leaders, is to help them and anchor them back to something so that they know what to expect.
Yeah, I do perceive what you're saying. How do you identify and leverage early small wins to build momentum when the end goal feels far away?
Mm. The simplest thing that you can do is look for the things that are already working and leverage those. Is if you know that those are things that are going to be needed in the future as well. Sometimes the assumption is that when we're changing something, that we're changing everything, and quite often that is not the case. So double down and reinforce the things that are going to stay the same and what's already working that will help us in this process, so people can see signs of already things that they're doing successfully, so they know that they've got the capability and we've got evidence of that. So that's one way. And I think it's just looking for kind of smaller things. Oftentimes we're looking for the the big sort of public milestones. And, it could be as simple as you hosted a forum to do a Q&A, and in the past 2 people turned up and no one asked a question or said anything, and then over time you're seeing more and more people coming to a town hall or a Q&A, more questions getting raised. So you can celebrate that and say, okay, well, there's an interest level here, and there's implied that potentially trust is also building. So and that might not be, it could be that you're rolling out a system that's got nothing to do with the system, but it's an indicator of how you're managing the process and people's curiosity around what's kind of coming next. So don't overthink it. Look for those small things and look for the things that are already working, and demonstrate how they're going to be helpful in the future world that you're moving to.
Yeah, great. Uh, what's your approach to integrating new tools or processes, for example, like AI or new software, without overwhelming your team?
Yeah, because they, get bombarded by so much, don't they? So, but yeah, this is another one that always makes me curious, because there seems to, with some of the organisations that I work with, they are fearful about people's ability to adapt and their willingness to try something new. But if you're really honest about it, every single day we're using new tools and systems. I mean, nobody gave anyone really like any insight to, here's this thing called ChatGPT, and people just started to get on and use it and experiment and see how it worked, and think about how they could, for want of a better word, use cases in their life, like how could this be helpful. So we have an amazing capacity to learn and adapt. I think context is the most important thing. So the why, and not moving too quickly to the how, particularly when it comes to systems, because more so than some other changes, systems can be a little bit more obvious in terms of it's a tangible thing. People can kind of see what I've got today and what's being proposed in the future. But if you skip over the why, like why are we doing this? Why is it important to the business? What's the value to the business? What's the value to you in your role? Then that's where you tend to see people kind of, potentially being fearful about what's being proposed, because they just don't have the right level of context to engage with it yet. And so I think for anything that you're doing, that's really important. I'd also say, as much as you can, do it in a way that doesn't just feel like you're layering one thing over another in a really quick succession is helpful to people. People need time to adapt and sit with something. Change is very energy consuming. And so we don't always do the best job in organisations of allowing people that space to move through. And yeah, I think that's really important. So, and probably more so, if the other thing I'm thinking about with AI is it feels like a bit of a race with some organisations. They're worried about being left behind, or my competitor's doing this thing. And it's again coming back to that context and that why. What's the business problem that you're trying to solve? If you really know that, everything else that comes after is much, much easier.
Yeah, I understand. And as you mentioned, the most horrifying thing within the organization is change. Everyone is afraid of being, change and the change as a whole. And thanks God that there are some guys and gals like you who are solving these kind of problems and pushing the organizations towards change. Resistance is a common challenge. Can you give an example where you turned a resistor into a champion, and what did that teach you?
Yeah, I've done quite a few ways of working projects, and when I say that, it's around the way organisations want their people to work within a physical space. So I don't know, pretty universally it's kind of understood as kind of agile ways of working, or Some organisations might still even call it like hot desking. And so it's this idea that, within an organisation, you have much more flexibility around the space that you use. And I had a leader many, many years ago who I was supporting through a process, and they were just dead against it. They didn't think that the metrics within the business case stood up in terms of, the value to the organisation, that cost benefit analysis. As a concept, it didn't make sense to them because it was so foreign and unfamiliar. They thought people would take advantage. They thought productivity would dip. There was all these things, and they were valid concerns, right? They were logical. But in spending some time with them, what it really boiled down is their overriding sense was a feeling of having a bit of irrelevance as a leader. So if I don't see my people in the same space every single day and they have much more autonomy about how they manage their work, well, what am I here for? Like their model of leadership was really that I'm there almost sitting side by side and really like actively kind of directing them and supporting them and helping them. And they couldn't understand how that would work. And there was, other things that were associated with that fear of irrelevance. So when we better understood that and we were able to work through that, a lot of those fears lifted and they started to think about it differently. And, they still, were skeptical about certain elements, but the brick wall was now more like a glass wall, and they could see sort of possibility. And I think a lot of the time with resistance, that's what it is. It's not always the thing that the person offers as the reason for why they're not keen or, they don't think it will work. It's most times much, much more deeply hidden or even unconsciously hidden. The person themselves might not even realise that this is what's driving the way that they're thinking. And so you have to do that work to really understand. And we don't always get that right in organisations either. Sometimes we don't have the capacity, the time, so the feeling is just to keep pushing forward, and then almost it's hope becomes the strategy. Is we just hope that over time people will either get worn down or that they'll get a light bulb moment. But more often than not, we need to help them have that light bulb moment, and that's really what the resistance piece is taking the time to do that work. So, and you have to do it quite rapidly. Yeah.
Oh, so wise, so wise. Next question would be, how do you support your team's emotional well-being and morale during prolonged periods of uncertainty?
Yeah. I think if you can normalize that what they feel is okay, and if you can almost validate some of that, then that certainly helps. Change is, by its nature, it is different. That is what it is. We're at point A and we want to get to point B, and the bit in the middle is really unknown, and the point B, sometimes is unknown. And so naturally, we're humans and we're kind of wired to sort of move away from things that seem unfamiliar because it has a sense of sort of threat attached to that. And I just spend a lot of time talking to people around, if you feel uncomfortable, that's completely normal and it's okay. Don't dismiss it, sit with it, try and understand why.
But
Because
why we do
they
that?
can
Sometimes we try to neglect some of our emotions.
Yeah, maybe we don't always have the tools and know what to do with it. And so if you acknowledge it, you go, okay, well, I've acknowledged it, but I still don't know what to do with it. So that could be a reason why. I think in certain cultures, saving face as well, like not wanting to admit to self or even others, that you feel like that you feel any less confident or, for want of a better word, good about something, like sort of putting on a brave face. So habit, like if we work in an organisational structure where we just haven't done that in the past, that's not really welcomed or celebrated by others, and we're less likely to do it. I think there's a myriad of different reasons. But yeah, just spending time thinking about that, and then what I try and do is anchor them back into what's true, what's still working, and what's still within their control. because there's always something, and it might be very minor, and they might have dismissed it or thought it seemed a bit insignificant in the moment. But if you can do that, say it's okay that you feel like this, it's really normal. Let's have a conversation around all the things that we do know that feels a little bit more in your control. Then you can slowly sort of lift that fog of thinking and open up their mindset to thinking about things in a different way and being a little bit better. The other thing I'd say, and again, I think organisations collectively still having to get a little bit better at this, creating realistic plans. I know I said before the plan is not everything, but like when you sit down and you map something out and you think about the reality of what we're asking people to do, that's on us as leaders first, and whoever's driving that change process, to not already get people at a point of disservice where we're asking them to do something that fundamentally we know is going to be very challenging or difficult. And the other thing I do with the teams that I work with is really try, especially if it's not habit, build that into their plans and their processes. So build in time for reflection, build in time where they're not, working on or within the change cycle, so that they can manage their own energy, their own emotions, their own well-being. Some organisations are fantastic at this now in terms of offering different kind of services and supports and other ways. But the cheapest thing that we can do and the easiest thing that we can do is give them time. But if we haven't planned for that and we've just hoped that that will emerge, typically it's not a great strategy.
Yeah. So enlightening. Thank you so much for a great answer. What are practical ways to maintain psychological safety on a team when everyone is stressed about change?
Model it. So even if you're unsure, ask for input, show a level of vulnerability, celebrate when people are open and candid in their feedback. When someone speaks up, thank them. We don't always do that. Well, when I say we don't, I'm talking about organisations that I work with and experiences that I've had in the past. Is it's not always the first thing that someone thinks to do is to say thank you so much for your feedback and for sharing. Even if we don't have an answer, we don't need to have an answer in the moment, but we need to acknowledge the fact that they've been brave enough. So leaders need to lead first and do that, but very quickly they also need to recognise it when others do that and reinforce that that's a practice that's welcomed and valued, and then people go, okay, I can see that this is how we do things around here, and that safety absolutely can build quite quickly.
And this is something, unfortunately,
yes.
most of the leaders and managers don't want to do. I don't know why, because they think that there should be a kind of, hierarchy within the organization, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, the leaders that I coach, there's definitely some of that kind of, the feeling of I'm in a role and I'm at a level where, either I should know this, I should have the answer, I shouldn't sort of show any kind of perceived weakness or but we're a human before we're an employee.
Yeah.
So,
Sometimes
so
we
a lot of
forget.
what we talk, yeah, and so we talk about that in coaching and say, people are not looking for you to be a robot and not show, humility and vulnerability. They actually welcome that because then they can see that in themselves and, it's relatable, and they actually respect that. But I think maybe it's historically just, how organisations have run, like you said, like particularly if there's strong degrees of hierarchy, there's, sort of these practices that have built up over time and it just feels really unfamiliar. So, but being a leader is hard. I always say that it's really hard because you've got, usually someone above you and there's a lot at stake. And then you've got all these people looking to you, and then you're having to manage your own self and thinking about, well, who do I want to be through this process? How do I want to show up? What's important to me? What are my values? How can I lean on those through this? And so there's a lot of internal constant cogs turning about reconciling all of that, when things are moving quite fast paced. So, which is why I probably went into coaching more recently, like in my career, because when I was working in large organisational transformations, and so much of my time was spent supporting leaders around exactly these types of conversations, I was like, there's a real gap here. We might have the plan, we might have a change management resource, we've got other kind of people like yourself, HR, OD practitioners in the organisation, but that's not their primary focus, is to coach the leader, when oftentimes that's the thing that makes the biggest impact for them and their confidence and their own kind of assurance and safety to speak up. So, yeah, that's why I went into that work.
That's great. Next question would be, how do you, as a leader, manage your own stress and uncertainty to avoid burnout and
Mm-hmm.
remain a stable anchor for your team?
Yeah, personally, and I don't profess to be perfect at this, but really just trying to set boundaries and having things that are non-negotiable. So I'm the least athletic person that you'll ever meet, but I really enjoy going to the gym. So that's my thing, and I get up at usually 5 is when my alarm goes off, and so I'm kind of at the gym by sort of 5:30, something like that. And that's how I like to start my day, is just having something where I'm not really responsible or accountable to anybody else. Do my workout, clear my head, think about, towards the end of the workout, what have I got on for the day and the week, and start to sort of make that transition. But and almost always, unless I'm traveling or unless I've got a workshop perhaps that is really early in the morning, I'm pretty good at sort of protecting that time up until about 8, and then I've fully switch into work mode.
So you are a morning person.
And I think I would say I'm actually not, but I've learned to be over time. I think I'm better and more effective at doing that in the morning. I don't enjoy it. Probably like many leaders, is you put your whole self into, I think most people are really passionate about what they do. And so they're giving a lot of themselves in a working day. And for me, that's quite energy consuming. So I just find that I'm not great at the end of the day. But I think it's a good point though, like know your own patterns and know your own, like what works for you, and then try and have those honest conversations around what those boundaries look like, because other people work much better in the evening, or they might prefer to exercise, or their exercise of choice just happens to be at night time. So I don't think there's any one size, but knowing yourself, knowing what works for you, and then kind of having clear conversations and having some boundaries around that, I think is really important. And, it sounds funny to say this because people go, well, you're a coach and you would say that. But I think I've always either had a leader who acted as my coach in roles, or even now I have my own coach, whether it's a coach, whether it's a mentor, whether it's, just a really trusted peer, having someone in your circle who you can bounce ideas off and also tell them what's important to you, and help you protect things like boundaries, is really important, because our intent and our action don't always match up, and that's because we're human. And sometimes we need a bit of help with that.
I understand. Nice answer. Next question. Looking back, what's one thing you would do differently in a past change initiative, knowing what you know now?
Mm. I'm much better at it now, and I think experience has helped. But slowing down at the start, again, probably to the example that I gave earlier in career, it's just this desire to show value and impact, and potentially rushing to get to that point. But if your foundations are not solid and you haven't done that work, it will come back, and you'll either have to revisit, rework, and it can really knock your confidence, I think, when that happens. So I think really holding true to what you know is important, and taking the time to do some of those things up front is really key. And that's certainly what I spend a lot of time advising organisations on. They're so quick to want to move forward, and it's like, okay, only if we're confident that all of these markers are kind of met, and that we feel like the pace that we've taken to get here has been shared by everybody, and everybody, has been happy to move forward. We're not just doing it for kind of some arbitrary reason, or because we set a date in a plan, which you wouldn't believe the amount of times this happens, is when you interrogate, well, what was the purpose that we've chosen this milestone at this particular time? That there's not sometimes some logic behind that. So yeah, slowing down is definitely something I've learned. In the past, like not having done that. Regret. Yeah, probably. I mean, in terms of not getting better outcomes, or having the value of hindsight and thinking, I think that could have been easier. Then yeah, if that's regret. But I feel like you kind of have to chalk everything up as it is what it is. You can't rewrite the past, and you need to just learn from it. So, but I definitely think I would have made my life easier in some of those circumstances had I have not been so quick to move forward and show that, perception of value, that there's other ways of doing it.
Yeah. This is absolutely natural. What skill or mindset do you believe will be most critical for leaders navigating change in the next 5 years?
Discomfort tolerance. Yeah. We don't, we touched on it earlier, but we are wired as humans to like things to be known and predictable and so-called safe. And the reality is the world is very complex. It is changing at a rate that, we've never seen before, and will continue to do so. And so I think there is just automatic discomfort that goes with that, because things are constantly going to be new and emerging, and we're going to be trialing different things and testing different things, and that's unfamiliar. And so there's a level of discomfort that comes with that. I think the leaders that are okay with that and have ways of managing that, both for themselves and for their teams and their organisations, will be the ones that really thrive. That ambiguity, I say to people, if you don't like ambiguity, and if you don't like, to your question right at the beginning, messiness, don't work in the field of change. Because that is the one thing that you are guaranteed to have. And so, if that's not for you, and it's not, right, like some people like to know exactly what they're coming into in their day, and they like to have a pattern and that predictability, and there's certainly roles that absolutely lean more to that, and that's fine, and we need those people as well. But if you are a leader who's okay with discomfort, and you have a level of calm around how you think about ambiguity and how you lead through ambiguity, I feel like they're the ones that are really going to succeed going forward.
Another nice answer. Thank you so much. The last question would be, if you could give one piece of advice to a leader about to step into their first major change project, what would it be?
That they don't need to be the expert. Sometimes the model of leadership is that you start somewhere in an organisation, and then you take opportunities and you sort of move up. But early career, at least from what I observe and experience, is people get those opportunities because they're technically very proficient at something, or they have a level of expertise in something that is recognised and valued by the organisation. and that is really supported and promoted and valued and rewarded. But when you get to leadership and particularly senior levels of leadership, that's not as important. You know, you have other people around you that have those skills, and I think sometimes leaders misinterpret and feel like they need to be the expert of the thing that they're trying to transform. They don't. They need to build a really amazing team and have people around them that have different expertise that are going to help them get to their end goal. And in often times, it's actually better to be open about that at the beginning and say, I'm not an AI expert. I'm not a, you know, SAP expert if it's a system thing. I'm not a, you know, maybe they're not even a culture, you know, their background, if they're doing a culture transformation, I'm not a culture expert. But I know people and I know how to build good teams and I know, you know, how to engage with an organisation and I know what we're trying to achieve as an organisation strategically. That's what they bring to the table. And I think don't forget that and really lean into that and don't pretend or want to try and be an expert in the process. Their job is to provide an anchor, a sense of, you know, purpose around the why, some transparency and clarity around where they're going, to be curious around the different options of how they kind of get there, and then to build trust. Everything else you can just learn as you go,
Wow, great.
is my opinion.
That was the last question. What's your question for me? Do you have a question to wrap
Yeah.
up?
So, what do you get out of doing these the podcast? Like, what's the biggest takeaway that you get each time you sit down with someone? Because they're quite varied in terms of your guests and the topics that you talk about.
You
So,
know, I'm very interested in different people. I'm interested in
mhm,
human being in general, and whenever I talk to someone and try to, create a podcast, uh, of course, some experienced people like you, I learned a lot, and I feel that I'm talking to God. You know, I feel something great. I feel blessed and I feel satisfied. I start daydreaming. I I'm not here now. I'm not here. I'm out of my mind. It's kind of mind blowing job. Beside learning so many things about HR, about organization, about these kind of things, the human connection that I can achieve via this kind of podcasts and these kind of sessions and meetings are great. These kind of feelings, and I don't want to say it's kind of feeling. It's kind of I should say so many feelings all together, and I can achieve
mhm,
them. And uh, sometimes due to some brutality in different part of the world, you feel ashamed, embarrassed, exhausted, burned out. You want to give up. But sometimes when I come to myself, I visit some people like you. I try to talk about good things in life. I would be hopeful for the future. And
mhm,
this is something that I feel. I don't know, maybe others don't have the same feeling about this kind of podcasts and this kind of sessions or meetings. Especially where I come from, there will be so many battles between people, and sometimes most of the people they are not patient enough. They do not have. They say
mhm,
that they do not have time enough to listen to this kind of things to level up themselves, promote themselves. But I think that they are far from humanity. Human being needs to be touched by others uh, emotionally, not only physically. And this kind of thing happens via communications. We have to communicate as much as possible. Most of our battles, our conflicts come from not talking to each other. Lack of
mhm,
communication. So we have to
Yeah.
communicate as much as possible, learn from each other, and I believe that every human being is a symbol of a great thing in the universe. It's a great a symbol of divine and divinity. In my point of view, there is a connection, and I believe in spiritual integrity. There is something
Mhm.
beyond this worldly life. But as I mentioned about something about humanity, I said that we forget that we are. Sometimes we forget we are human. Sometimes we forget that we are here for another purpose. We are here to learn, and the best way to learn and to promote our knowledge is communication. So this is my
Yeah.
answer to your question.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And I think more so now than ever, right? With this, like, there's this feeling like AI, everyone's talking about it. And I was like, you know, AI is going to absolutely transform our lives and help, but it's not going to replace everything. You
Yes,
still need
yes.
to have relationships and be able to communicate and be curious and all of those sorts of things. And I always try and remind myself, and I'm not perfect. It's easy for anyone to forget sometimes, but I remind myself whenever I'm talking to a new team or engaging with a new organisation, everyone is just trying to do the best that they can with what they've got, And if we try and support each other to be better, then that's a good outcome for everyone. But you start with that mindset of they're still doing, the best that they can.
Yeah, I understand. Maybe all of the people one day uh, maybe will think like this. I hope so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but keep putting out the content and helping people to be curious. It's
Yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. I'm gonna stop recording now and we can have a chit chat for 1 minute
Sure,
afterward.
sure.
Thank you so much, Lou. It was a great session. Have a great day, great weekend, great week, great month, and great year ahead. Bye bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.